Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to this, the Irish Stammering Association Speaker Series. We are very happy to have Dr. Cameron Raynes as our guest speaker for this event. So I would just like to quickly read Cameron's bio just before we actually pass it over to Cameron. So Cameron Raynes has a PhD on the moral subtext of Aboriginal oral history and teaches Aboriginal history and creative writing at the University of South Australia. His exploration of the removal of Aboriginal children from their families in South Australia in the mid-20th century was published in 2009 as The Last Protector. Cameron also writes fiction, and his debut novel, The First-Person Shooter, explored courage, adolescent love, and the experience of growing up with a stutter in a small country town. It was shortlisted for the National Adelaide Festival Awards for Fiction in 2018. So Cameron will be talking about the power threat meaning for framework. And I would like you all to just give Cameron a warm Irish welcome anyway. So, right, Cameron, pass over to you.
Cameron. Thanks, Stephen. It's wonderful to be here. It's 5:30 a.m. or just after 5:30 a.m. here in Adelaide on Saturday, the 22nd of February. So we're in the future over here, as I like to say. Yes. So thanks very much to Stephen and the Irish Stammering Association for this opportunity to speak to people about the PTMF, the power threat meaning framework. Just a bit of background. My academic field is Aboriginal history, and I teach creative writing and literature as well. But I began supervising a student in the speech therapy program here at Uni SA last year. Last year, I supervised a student, and prior to that, the year before, when I knew that I was going to have an honours student to co-supervise, I decided to dive deeply into the academic literature around stuttering. And a lot of it was around the mental distress of stuttering. That became apparent quite quickly, that a lot of the academic literature and research is on the mental distress of stuttering. And one of the things I read mentioned a new approach to doing psychology and psychiatry called the power threat meaning framework. And I'll get onto that. And that's just a little bit of background. As soon as I read those four words together, power threat meaning framework, I thought, wow, that's interesting just in the title itself. And it feels like it might have something to say about stuttering. And for me, it does have a lot to say about stuttering. I am a person who stutters, not a great deal these days, for various reasons, but it could come back just as strongly as it used to be at any point, I suspect. So I'm enjoying my fluency while I've got it. Okay, so there's a lot of information I'd like to give to you about this framework, and I want to be quite precise about it. So I am going to be reading from a tablet. So apologies in advance for that. I know it's not the best way to give a talk, but I just feel like I don't want to miss anything or leave anything out. Now I'm going to put this into presentation mode. Hopefully everyone can still see that. And let's go. My aim today is to convince you that the Power Threat Meaning Framework, the PTMF, offers a useful new way to look at stuttering, and in particular, the mental distress and troubling behaviours associated with it. From my perspective, that of a person who stutters, who has lived with anxiety, panic attacks, body dysmorphia, and bouts of mild to moderate depression, the PTMF seems to have much to offer. It also has relevance to other issues, including the importance of advocacy work, the relevance of group therapy, narrative, and agency in the life of the person who stutters. I will draw briefly on my own history of dysfluency to establish the effects that stuttering can have on mental health, just in case there's someone in the room who doesn't stutter. Maybe I should have asked for that at the beginning. I'll then describe the PTMF and discuss why it might be relevant to the stuttering community. Launched in the United Kingdom in 2018 as an alternative conceptual framework to the medical model of distress, the PTMF gives voice to what we know deep inside, that the real problem of stammering lies not in us, but in the fact that we live in societies in which dysfluency is seen as a deficit, and we are being constantly reminded of it. So what's it like to stutter? In case there's someone in the room who doesn't. I thought I was just a normal kid. The world was wonderful. I had friends. I was excited to go to school each day. I was 8 years old. Then the most terrible thing happened. Standing in front of my classmates, all the friends I had in the world, my mouth opened and closed and nothing came out. I was filled with shame and terror as I suddenly realised I couldn't speak like everyone else. I went home in tears, inconsolable. It seemed I was the only one cursed in this way. Despite being as smart as anyone in the class, I rarely put my hand up to answer a question. I felt shame and terror every time I opened my mouth, as I suddenly realised shame and terror every time I was made to get up in front of the class and read something out. I faked asthma so I could stay home. I felt like the ugliest person in the world. I was now 9 years old. My stutter grew in my mind. At times it seemed to be the only thing I thought about. I reached adulthood, having never told jokes because they require timing. I would never tell stories because they would put me at the centre of attention and would require an ending. And I loved stories, always have. I had much to say, but often stood by silently, watching and listening as the people around me stated their opinions, engaged in conversation, gossiped, traded light-hearted insults. In short, did all the amazing things that language makes possible. All the amazing things that allow a person to stake a claim to their rightful place in the social hierarchy that surrounds them. What started out as a simple neurophysiological glitch that affected the coordination of my mouth, tongue, vocal cords, and breathing became a full-blown psychosocial condition that affected just about everything I did. I had a sense of being damaged goods and was sure that others saw me in this way, or worse, as the most boring person in the room. The speech therapy I did only confirmed feelings of brokenness. Use your techniques, my therapist said. In other words, you must hide this shameful condition. What followed was 3 decades of being vigilant, making sure I didn't slip in public. 3 decades of choosing my words carefully and not taking up social space. 3 decades of avoiding employment I thought would require too much talking. In restaurants, I ordered the meal I could say rather than the dish I wanted to eat. I suffered panic attacks and anxiety disorder, intermittent mild depression, insomnia. I didn't give a speech on the day I got married. End of monologue. Though I studied from the time I could talk, the psychosocial aspects of stuttering began when I was 8, when my sense of self was still forming, when crucial connections were taking place in my brain. It was a trauma that played out daily for decades. And it's not just me. Research into people who stutter confirms that mental distress is closely associated with stuttering. And why wouldn't it be for a social species like Homo sapiens, for whom whole cultures are built around the notion of saving face and an emphasis on status, reputation, personal mastery, and honour? To not be able to speak feels like a constant existential threat, as if you have been reduced to an animal that grunts. Let's face it, the fluent have no idea of the extent of the unearned privilege their fluency confers on them. Mental distress seems an almost unavoidable consequence of stuttering, given the crucial role that verbal capacity plays in society, the premium society puts on fluency, and the privilege it bestows on its holder. And this is where the PTMF comes into play. In simple terms, the PTMF is based on the idea that mental distress operates largely from the outside in, not from the inside out. This honours the sense we have that mental distress has causes and meanings. It has context. The PTMF works on the assumption that at some point, everyone's experience makes sense. Their mental distress is an understandable response to the circumstances they find themselves in. It has been applied to thinking about the understanding and treatment of mental distress among various groups, including prisoners, mental health support groups, survivors of domestic violence, and people experiencing grief. While it has received significant support among academics, practitioners, and their clients, it has met with a hostile reception from the more traditional and conservative encampments in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. Under the PTMF, mental distress is an understandable effect of exposure to a perceived threat. With this threat stemming from a perceived or actual lack of power. Experienced by the distressed person. Both the power differential and threat are interpreted by the individual through the lens of narrative and meaning making, often in ways that consolidate or even amplify the threat. Mental distress is understood as a predictable, normal response by the body and mind to the threat associated with a feeling of powerlessness. The responses themselves, also referred to as coping mechanisms or coping behaviours, are intelligible responses to a person's history and circumstances. They are survival strategies which protect against the negative impact of power, in the words of Lucy Johnston, one of the key architects of the PTMF. The message for the person who stutters from the PTMF is this. You, and this is again the words of Johnston, you are experiencing an understandable and indeed adaptive reaction to threats and difficulties. Many others in the same circumstances have felt the same and would react the same way you have. In paying close attention to the circumstances and context of mental distress, the PTMF explicitly makes a connection between mental distress and social justice, for it understands that circumstances and context are at the root of the mental distress and must be tackled if the distress is to be alleviated. In contrast to traditional psychiatric concerns, which revolve around the question, what is wrong with you? The PTMF operates according to the following key questions. What has happened to you? Or how is power operating in your life? How did it affect you? What kinds of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? Or what is the meaning of these situations and experiences to you? And what did you have to do to survive? Or what kinds of threat response are you using? So there are actually 4 key components to the PTMF: power, threat, meaning/narrative, and response or coping behaviours. I want to go through them one by one and just sort of unpack what they mean for a person who stutters. Okay, stuttering is experienced as a loss of power, an inability to control one's vocal apparatus, a capacity taken for granted by the fluent person, lies at the heart of the lack of power people who stutter or stammer face. The member of Homo sapiens who cannot reliably produce speech to exert influence, demonstrate mastery, advocate for their needs, demand respect, create alliances, nurture friendships, or simply express themselves, is at risk of marginalisation and social diminution, or at least at risk of imagining these terrible outcomes as a real and imminent possibility. The covert stutterer may be especially prone to experiencing a loss of power. And I was covert for much of my life, not so much now. In desperately trying to keep their condition hidden, in acceding to the perceived social value of fluency, the covert person who stutters grants power both to their stutter and the perceived needs of the fluent people they interact with. In striving to be fluent for their listener, they grant power to that person. This can have a disastrous effect, and I'm aware of the irony of me appearing very fluent and saying these things, by the way, striving to be fluent for their listener. There is an irony there that I'm dealing with in my own funny way. This can have a disastrous effect on the sense of agency and authenticity of the person who stutters. In her study of the effect of flow states on people who stutter, Devlin notes the capacity of disfluency to make them question these very things, agency and authenticity. One of her interviewees admitted, "I would be constantly avoiding certain words, so I'd almost be letting the stutter control what I say, so I would never truly be expressing myself. I would never be truly authentic in what I was saying or being." And that was my experience a lot through those 3 decades of struggling with the whole thing. Germane also to the question of power and the secondary behaviours: eye shutting, twitching of face and head, hand gestures designed to help the flow of words. These things may be experienced also as a loss of control of basic bodily movements. Stuttering is experienced as a threat. We've already noted the risk of marginalisation and social diminution. As the young person who stutters grows into adulthood, many wonder how they will hold down a job, provide for themselves, or find a partner or friends. These were keenly felt existential threats in my late teens, 20s and 30s, and they are backed up by research on stuttering. The thread of stuttering is entangled with the common feeling for the person who stutters that when they stutter, something of their core, their essence, is on show. An essence that societal narratives have judged to be synonymous with lack and clumsiness, or even worse, cowardice and fear. This is a deeply unpleasant experience and can happen many times each day. For me, at least, it felt like I was being turned inside out every time I stuttered, so that everyone could see my feelings, the thing I feared, and which could bring me undone. Ruthlessly disempowering, it is made much worse when people around you laugh at or turn away from what has been revealed. The PTMF recognises that challenges to a person's identity may constitute some of the gravest threats possible. Hobson notes that a person bereaving the loss of their child may find themselves asking the terrible question, am I no longer a parent? Stuttering too presents a relentless threat to identity and a person's sense of authenticity. At various times in my life, I was plagued by questions such as, am I the sort of person who stays silent when they should speak up? Am I a coward? Even if I'm not, will others perceive me as one? It would have been very easy to slip into a sense of self that included conclusions such as, I'm not the kind of person who deserves to be heard, or I have nothing worth saying. By the age of 45, I had convinced myself I wasn't very brave. Not exactly a coward, but not very brave either. And there's some research, just a very brief snapshot of some of the research on that field. For Johnston and Boyle, the architects of the PTMF, the meaning a person in distress attributes to their condition has a narrative sensibility and is not simply personal, since it draws upon shared resources and discourses, nor is it straightforwardly under our control. Rather, it is something that we both make and find. They argue our own narratives, the stories we tell about our lives in order to make sense of our experiences, are derived from wider cultural narratives in which some ways of understanding, that is, some stories, are more available and socially sanctioned than others. The PTMF honours the fact that we create or ascribe to stories or narratives to live by and to make sense of our lives. The first story I told myself as a person who stutters was that I was different, and then almost immediately that I was lesser. For I knew there were people who turned away from me when I stuttered, and what else could I think other than that it was because I looked ugly when I was doing it. So I told myself I was ugly. Different, lesser, ugly. Some stories are more available and socially sanctioned than others. In the popular press, stuttering is almost always used as a metaphor for failure. The representation of stuttering in popular culture is equally problematic and adds up to this. In making sense of our experience of distress, we are invited to compare ourselves against prevailing social discourses, resulting in social shame when we fail to attain these ideals. Under the PTMF, coping behaviours are the reasonable responses a person makes to 1, their powerlessness, 2, the threats associated with that state, and 3, the publicly sanctioned narratives that surround, permeate, and explain the circumstances from which the state of powerlessness arises. For the person who stutters, the most common avoidance behaviours are generally selective mutism, word substitution, circumlocution, and the general rejection of opportunities to take up social space. The effect of living a life of avoidance is profound and includes an almost inevitable sense of inauthenticity. One of Devlin's interviewees spoke of the terrible effect of coping behaviours commonly associated with stuttering, offering insight into the impact of stuttering on their sense of stuttering and agency. She said, and it can be so frustrating not speaking up, not speaking out, not giving my honest opinion. And when I do try and speak out, I stammer. I often swap words around. So like, oh God, here we go again. I'm not being authentic because I'm having to swap words. Or even worse, you don't give a speech on the day you get married. So power, threat, meaning, response, I feel like they're all core to the experience of stammering or stuttering. What are some of the implications of the PTMF? While my relationship with speech therapy hasn't been great, I was a patient at Fremantle Hospital in Perth, Western Australia, from the age of 11, pretty much only lasted for a year or a year and a half. And I understand others have found speech therapy useful. I suspect it depends a lot on the relationship you develop with your therapist and the sense of agency you have around the intervention being offered. Are you moving willingly toward it, embracing it, making it your own, or is it being forced upon you in some way through, even if not by the therapist itself, via social pressure? If so, it's, in my experience, it's almost certainly not going to be effective. So while it's unwise to make generalizations, I mean, I guess I just have, those therapists who focus on fluency and masking seem stuck in the 1970s, using a technique I found useless and which ran the risk of contributing to the trauma I experienced. And to some extent, that's still the situation in Australia. The young person who stutters, who is encouraged to mask their disfluency via therapies such as smooth speech, and given no information on alternative therapies, may come to believe that they must acquiesce to the idea that stuttering is socially unacceptable and should be covered up. Speech therapists would do well to consider the words of Penny Farrell, who works who probably most of you know about, who says, "I see myself as an ally, a cheerleader, a wingman, a sympathetic ear, a non-judgmental menu of options to explore." And she goes on, "My why has shifted from perceiving stammering as a pathology to understanding it as a diversity. My how has shifted from fluency shaping to championing individual choice, reducing shame, diminishing isolation, and valuing well-being far above the nature of how words travel out." With its commitment to seeing humans as active, purposeful agents, creating meaning and making choices in their lives, the PTMF has ramifications not only for speech pathologists, but for all those we interact with. I'm thinking here of its call to 1, social justice, 2, the narrative understanding of a life, 3, the agency of those experiencing mental distress, and 4, the importance of group work in dealing with certain aspects of mental distress. I want to briefly go through those 4 things. The PTMF recognises that power differentials and perceived threats are at the root of much mental distress and must be tackled via social advocacy and action if such distress is to be ameliorated. Johnston argues that in contrast to traditional diagnostic labels, which obscure people's personal meanings, conceal their stories, and sever the link between the distress and the circumstances of their lives, the PTMF restores the link between distress and social injustice. In this, the PTMF is complementary to the advocacy and action framework known as the social model of disability, which sees disability as a social experience, not a personal condition. This approach recognises that removing structural barriers and changing attitudes in society to create fully inclusive access and opportunities for people living with disability requires broad cultural and policy shifts. And this is what organisations like the Irish Stammering Association, Stammer, 50 Million Voices, Stutter, Stammerly, are doing, along with an array of podcasters, bloggers and vloggers who stutter. We create stories, narratives to live by and to make sense of our lives. But it is not only the autobiographical element that we need to consider. There are at least 3 significant and distinct types of stories we ascribe to and live by. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, stories that the world tells about us through popular culture, films, depictions of people who stutter. And 3, the stories we tell ourselves about the world around us. So what sort of world do I live in? Is it full of threat? Is it full of opportunities? That in itself is a kind of story that we're constantly telling ourselves. The stories I mentioned earlier that I told myself as a kid, that I was ugly, different, lesser, were the first kind. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And did not consider there were tens of millions of others like me dealing with similar issues. They were solipsistic stories, the stuff of nightmares, disconnected from the community of people who stutter. My community. Johnson and Boyle argue that narratives can be other than this. They can be helpful and healing. They write, narratives have the potential to provide a common language about the emergence, experience, and expression of distress, thus restoring the central role of meaning and providing a foundation for positive change. Johnson argues that narratives co-constructed by individuals, families, and communities can potentially provide explanations for and validation of distress, facilitate contact with others in similar circumstances, as we're doing right now, offer relief from shame and guilt, and convey hope for positive change. They focus only on the first 2 types of story, though, Johnson and Boyle, and there appears to be little research around the 3rd type, that one I mentioned, the ones we tell ourselves about the world around us. I feel like there's a clear need for this, as such stories will give important information about the perceived and actual threats that we associate with stammering and stuttering. Just as much as the first 2 types, this 3rd type of story can determine whether or not we take up the social space that we are entitled to. Within the stuttering community, agency and self-efficacy are invoked around discussion of things such as disclosure and voluntary stuttering, strategic actions designed to advertise a person's stutter. For many people who stutter, me included, disclosing that you stutter and deliberate voluntary stuttering may have a profound effect, not only in relation to relief from the extreme anxiety that comes from trying to hide the condition, but also on an individual's capacity to speak without blocks or repetitions. For some of us, and I know it's just for some of us, these 2 things are clearly entangled. Why? Perhaps because disclosure can flip the power differential on its head. So the power threat meaning framework, it's all about, what situation you're in, how is power acting in your life, So power is central. So perhaps disclosure flips that power equation, that power differential. The person who stutters, who says, I stutter, is saying, I need time to express myself. They will hopefully come to see that they are also implicitly saying, what I have to say is worth waiting for. They might even come to the realization that they are saying to the fluent person, if you're not prepared to give me the time to talk, the deal is off, I'll walk away. When the person who stutters frames their self-disclosure as a challenge to the hegemony of fluency on the fluent, or the dominance of the fluent, the usual pattern of the exercise of power is challenged, and I think may even be reversed. My own journey from that child for whom the classroom was a constant source of terror and humiliation, to the 35-year-old who chose not to give a speech at his own wedding, through to the 50-something who became a public speaking coach and was twice a finalist in the South Australian Speaker of the Year competition, couldn't be understood without recourse to discussion of pivotal moments of agency. These moments, like signposts, directed me onto roads I hadn't considered possible, and a realignment of how I saw myself in the world. A realignment that resulted in public speaking becoming one of my great joys. The use of group work. Group work doesn't need justification, but it is interesting that those working within the PTMF suggest that group work offers things that individual therapy can't. Harper argues that the kind of narrative therapy that the PTMF advocates may be most effective in group settings, where the effects of others witnessing and validating our stories can be powerful. So just being in that environment where you're hearing stories from other people that resonate with you provides a validation of our own stories. He sees a role for therapists here. Quote, therapists could, maybe should, inform themselves and clients about such networks and support their development as allies, end quote. Where to from here? And I'm getting towards the end, and thanks for bearing with me. I know it's hard to just hear someone reading out for a long time. The PTMF raises many questions. How might it change the way we think about the efficacy of exposure therapy, desensitization, avoidance reduction therapy, and the possibility of retraining the mind to have a new set of associations around speaking? How effective, which I think it has great potential for all of those things. How effective can cognitive behavioural therapy be when damaging societal narratives continue to exist? My own experience suggests that a person can't simply think themselves out of the mess that stuttering can induce. Rather, it is necessary to act in the world, to come to a solution through speaking, stuttering, and taking up social space in an intentional, deliberate way that involves radical volition. For me, the solution to my distress was to lean into stuttering. I had to welcome fear and shame in order to diminish them, in order to inoculate myself these things. And for me, the answer, and again, I know this isn't for everyone, but the answer for me was in the counterintuitive. When you're driving a car, sliding on ice, the worst thing that you can do is to steer away from the direction that you're in. The thing that you have to do is to slide, to steer into the mess that you're in. And I feel like this is a useful metaphor for thinking about stuttering and how to deal with it. Like that driver on an icy road, I had to learn to do the counterintuitive. I had to learn to steer into the slide. In terms of first steps as to where we take the PTMF in terms of research, I think it would be useful to run a qualitative study that puts the 6 key questions of the PTMF to people who stutter. These consist of the 4 questions I noted earlier. What has happened to you? How did it affect you? What sense did you make of it? What did you have to do to survive? Power, threat, meaning, response. And 2 other questions identified by Johnson and Boyle. What are your strengths, which can also be thought of as what access to power resources do you have? And what is your story? Asking these 6 questions of people who stutter will help to ascertain both the appropriateness of the questions and the patterning of the responses by people who stutter to them. Second, there appears to be little research around the 3rd type of story that I mentioned, the ones we tell as people who stutter about the world around us. I feel like there's a clear need for this, as such stories may lay bare the threats associated with the phenomena of stuttering and may link into cognitive behavioural therapy once we know the stories that we tell ourselves about what and who we are and what we can do. Okay, in conclusion, I'm on the verge of wrapping up. Know this: if you have experienced distress as a result of stuttering, you are not alone. It's no reflection on you as a person. On the contrary, it's a reflection on the premium placed on verbal dexterity, on fluency by societies and cultures throughout the world. The PTMF raises many interesting issues in relation to not only understanding the mental distress commonly associated with stuttering, but also as to how we might determine the most promising therapeutic interventions in the realms of both psychology and speech therapy. It suggests, for instance, that certain speech therapy approaches may be more useful than others, including client-centered approaches, therapy that looks at the whole person, and therapy that incorporates group and narrative work. While the PTMF is largely agnostic on the question of psychological therapy, it may also suggest that certain such interventions may be more useful than others. Might, for instance, acceptance and compassion theory be better placed than cognitive behaviour therapy? Such things are vitally important. As we know, every time a child who stutters is asked to submit to an intervention, that intervention should, at the very least, do no damage. The application of a purely medical model in either therapeutic field doesn't satisfy this requirement and leaves children exposed to possible harm. Among people who stutter, there is growing recognition that people who stutter must have a say in the therapies offered to them. Stuttering organisations around the world are leading the charge. People who stutter and their allies are reading the literature, pushing back against outdated therapeutic modalities that see their clients as broken, broadcasting their objections to these modes, and advocating for change. Speech pathologists and mental health professionals alike must be educated to understand the needs of people who stutter and encouraged to try new approaches to working with them. Finally, I don't want to suggest that to have a stutter is an overwhelmingly negative experience. On the contrary, there are many great things about being a person who stutters. I don't think I would have become a writer if not for my stutter. And of course, belonging to this amazing community is one of the real highlights for all of us, I hope. I'm just loving my journey among the world of people who stutter. We need to find and appreciate such stuttering game. And so I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. What if people who stutter us are more likely than others to come to the idea that the self, the protagonist that each of us creates to make sense of our lives, and which is wrapped up in the stories we tell ourselves, what if we are more likely than others to come to the idea that that self is a continual work in progress? What if, confronted continuously by a seeming lack of authenticity, we gain clarity on what's required to achieve it? What if the experience of stuttering, with its constant challenges and demands on selfhood, allows the possibility of a heightened sense of authenticity? As Crystal Kubert says, the challenges I face as I learn how to be my authentic self have given me a deeper understanding of who I am. And I'd like to end on that note. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'd be delighted to take some questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well done. Brilliant.
Cameron, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop the recording, and then we can just take some questions just from the gallery then. Okay.